Mary-Louise, that cluster is at 17, expected to grow when today's numbers are released. How concerning is it?
It's very concerning. However, we have, as I think your previous guest mentioned, one of the best contact tracing teams in the world. They'll be working very hard 24/7 to try to identify all the contacts. The important thing to identify is the source. Who was the source, so that they can work from there as well. So it is concerning because, of course, the northern beaches are connected by bus all the way into the CBD, and, of course, the authorities will identify how likely it is that anybody that could have been a significant contact caught one of those buses to go into town and therefore potentially spread it, or, of course, use their car. So it has ramifications, but given the wonderful turnout by the locals for testing, I'd say that they are in a very good position to contain this very rapidly.
You mentioned identifying a source, and it has been confirmed that it was an international strain that started this cluster. What does that mean in terms of contact tracing?
Well, colleagues and myself have been calling for rapid antigen testing as people arrive from overseas. And, of course, for staff who work in these high-risk areas of quarantine hotels or at the airport. And so I think it's timely for the authorities to start thinking, now that we have very good rapid point-of-care tests that have very high levels of accuracy for labelling somebody negative, that if, for example, it was a flight crew, an Australian flight crew, then they could be identified as negative, take a home kit home with them and stay in isolation for a couple of days, test again. If they're negative, they're okay. Of course, the overseas flight crew, they don't get tested at all, and they go to hotels often with other guests who aren't return travellers. So they pose a risk, and we've seen one particularly from America. So flight crews coming from the Northern Hemisphere are posing a risk to the community because they come from a highly prevalent area. So they need testing. Without exception, everybody needs to be tested.
And in terms of this particular cluster, there was concerns raised about seated venues. We know that the Avalon RSL in particular has been highlighted as a risk. Is there now a risk of this becoming a super spreader through these various seated events?
Indoor seated events try very hard to control spread. And one excellent issue here, if there's any advantage in this, is that people in these events have to use their licence to enter and, of course, leaving. But there is the New South Wales app that you can use to tap in and tap out, which is a great idea. So that helps for contact tracing. But being indoors, if the airflow change isn't high enough, then, of course, if somebody is emitting it, they're speaking loudly, they're laughing, they're shouting, or they're singing, then, of course, their particles can go further. And very light particles, what's called droplet nuclei, can hang in the air for longer than droplets. And if there's not enough air conditioning, if they don't get removed fast enough, and during COVID, until we go back to the pre-COVID times, all of these venues need to increase their airflow 100% from fresh air from outside, even higher than what they have at the moment, something that equates to, say, a hospital ward at 60 litres per second per person, and an engineer will understand that, so that people inside are at less risk.
Do you think that New South Wales as a whole has become too complacent? It's been really weeks since we had any local transmission. Have we taken it for granted?
I think that we've had over 30 days of no cases except for the cleaner who acquired COVID at work from a quarantine hotel, and a driver who acquired COVID from passengers from the airport. So it's not that the community are complacent, it's that overseas and quarantine hotels are placing the community at risk because there's this gap in the barriers that we put up for infection prevention and control. And to close that gap, we need to do more testing. One, of staff who are working in these high-risk areas. They need to have more testing, not just once a week with a PCR test, because they're at risk for the 6 other days requiring it and picking it up. But point-of-care testing rapidly every day at the end of their shift. And, of course, everybody that touches the soil in Australia has to be tested. And then we would have remained at a very, very, very low risk and be able to go to these venues and listen to music and enjoy ourselves.
Mary-Louise McLaws, appreciate your time. Thank you.
My pleasure, Stella.